everybody. Welcome to our second Bridging Science and Religion lecture by Dr. Peter Saulson. This is part of a grant called Scientists and Synagogues, and with this grant we are aiming to support scientists early in their career, strengthen connections between scientists and the broader Central New York Jewish community, and encourage participants to explore relationships between science and Judaism. This program consists of this seminar series, a one-on-one opportunity to have a science and religion mentor, and community gatherings. So without further ado, this program is supported by a grant run by Sinai and Synapses. It's in consultation with the AAAS Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, and it's funded by the John Templeton Foundation. And today our speaker is Dr. Peter Saulson. Peter Saulson is the Martin A. Pomerantz 1937 Professor of Physics at Syracuse University. After earning his degrees at Harvard and Princeton and working at MIT, he came to Syracuse, where he has served on the faculty for 28 years. For close to 4 decades, he has been engaged in the search for gravitational waves, a cosmic messenger that has now allowed us to find black holes and to study their properties in unprecedented ways. He served 2 terms as spokesperson of the LIGO Scientific Collaboration, the group that first discovered gravitational wave signals 3 years ago. In recent years, he has made close study of the works of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Saulson's encounters with Heschel's writings are the basis for what he will be sharing with us in this lecture series. Dr. Saulson.
Thank you. My thanks to everyone for coming out on such a dark and wet and stormy night. And I'm happy to see a number of you all who were at lecture number 1 and some people who weren't. Either way, I hope that you will have an equal level of ease or difficulty, as the case may be, dealing with tonight's material. I hope it's the ease and not the difficulty. So let's get started. Let me say a bit about what I want to talk about after reminding those of you who were here last time and informing those of you who were not at the first lecture what my key points were. I was especially interested in that lecture in talking about the concept of wonder, which plays a profound role in philosophy and science and is also a key touchstone in the thought of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And while most people in science, philosophy, or whatever take it as the concept of wonder as an entry point into their own fields, Heschel is making the strong point that it's also an entry level, a doorway into religious thought, into a connection with God. And he calls out our own capacity to wonder as the most wonder-evoking aspect of the world. And in tonight's material, I'll come back to the question of when does Heschel point to something and say, this is what you really ought to pay attention to. And I was comparing and contrasting Heschel's treatment of wonder with some famous physicists. I found an especially wonderful remark by Richard Feynman that astonished me when I realized that Feynman, by my definition, was actually a religious person, even though he said, oh, no, you might call this a religious experience, but the God I learned about in Sunday school as a kid was not worthy of my attention. But actually, he was actually thinking almost as profoundly about wonder as my hero Heschel. So in the spirit of being able to fit everything that I usually take an hour to say on one slide, here is a summary of what I'm going to talk about tonight. The topic is time and our experience of it, and how that connects with time as the physics that I understand and that Carl understands says things about it. And finally, what Heschel and, if I'd had more time, other religious thinkers have to say about it. So there's a tension that you will see running through my whole treatment. Most of us as human beings, thinking about how it is that we live our lives, what is the texture or structure of our lives, feel ourselves to be embedded in time that flows, to move from the past through the present to the future, but along this sort of moving present that sweeps us forward. And when I talk about that, I want to point to that cluster of ideas and call it temporality. And temporality is such an important aspect of our lives that it really conditions everything we do and think, and also gives us the biggest challenge. What are we to do with this ability to interact from now and try to impact the future? Physics, as I will show, has such a different view of the world, it's almost hard to bring it into contact with this, I'll call this human view, the personal view of time. As I'll say more in a bit, the physics as we understand it, mostly based on the theory of relativity, argues rather strongly, at least according to most physicists, that there's no such thing as the flow of time, there's no such thing as the passage of time, there's not even any such thing as now. There is no special moment in history. All of history, from the deepest past to the farthest future, is somehow present. Language fails us. Somehow equally real. And when I want to emphasize that concept, I'll talk about the eternal view of existence. And the wonderful thing that Heschel does with this divergence of philosophical views about time is to use it as a resource for religious thinking. And I will walk us through a summary of Heschel's theology of time, in which he says that Jewish living is actually, if you want to think about it in one sentence, what is it about? It's devoted to redeeming temporal existence by linking it to the eternal. So this is what I will try to convince you of in more detail in the rest of the talk. So I'll start with time as we perceive it, then time as physics presents it, and finally have some words to say about Heschel's theology of time. Now, my wife Sarah would not forgive me if I didn't feature Bob Dylan as one of the great artists and thinkers of all time. And I don't actually disagree with her. Here is a wonderful pair of lines from the lyrics of Dylan's song, You're a Big Girl Now. And how about if we start with some reading? Does everyone have a source sheet? Anyone not get one? We're all good. Karen, would you like to read this pair of lines from Dylan, source one?
Time is a jet plane, it moves too fast. Oh, but what a shame if all we've shared can't last.
Can you hear that raspy voice? Stephen, how about from Macbeth, number 2?
Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this pretty pace from day to day.
Petty pace, please.
Petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time.
Great, great. Sarah, how about the James Joyce verse?
Young life is breathed on the glass. The world that was not comes to pass.
Thank you all. Okay, so what do these 3 bits of poetry have in common? What are they trying to evoke? What kind of understanding or feeling do they all share? Julie?
That temporal flow.
The flow of time. Yeah, Brenda, were you going to say something similar?
I was, except I was going to, what caught my eye on the Macbeth to the last syllable of recorded time.
Yes, right.
And what does that mean? And when you think it was written, 400 and some years ago.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so you can't describe human experience without talking about time creeping at this petty pace or moving too fast, or in that line from the James Joyce poem, the world that was not comes to pass. Okay, so something that didn't exist suddenly exists, and he doesn't say it then because this is a poem about the birth of a boy. At least it doesn't say it in this verse, maybe I think in a later one. The things that come to pass also come to pass away. And this is both like the joy and the tragedy of human existence, right? It's what makes life poignant. I challenge you to find 1/100th as many poetic evocations of the non-passage of time, of static existence, as you do these evocations of the passage of time. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever seen any poet or songwriter or anyone try to convince you that the world is just a thing from beginning, middle, and end. And if anyone knows an example that would contradict that, I'd really be curious. All right, so that's poets. Now I want to turn to one of the most famous philosophers who identified his work with the idea that the passage of time is of the essence of the world. And this is someone who is mostly forgotten today, unjustly, in my opinion, Henri Bergson, who flourished around the start of the 20th century, last few decades of the 19th, and won the Nobel Prize for Literature. They don't give one in philosophy, but he was considered such a great poetic writer that this was 6 years after Einstein's Nobel Prize. He was 21 or 22, right? Yeah. Bergson won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And if we have time, I might explain later why I'm thinking about Bergson and Einstein together. But for now, let's just look at this one sentence from Bergson's 1905 book, An Introduction to Metaphysics. And Brenda, would you read source 4?
There is one reality at least, which we all seize from within, by intuition, and not by simple analysis. It is our own personality and is flowing through time, our self which endures.
Okay, so
Yes,
kind of this. Sorry, Marie?
What shocks me is our self which endures.
Yeah.
That the self, it's really a problem. Does it endure? I don't think.
Well,
I don't think
yes,
that's
the word enduring, okay? That's a good one to focus on. I don't think he meant endures forever, but I do think he wanted people to be thinking of the question of the continuity you have between the person you were yesterday or a year ago or 20 years ago and the person you are today and the person you will be, God willing, 20 years in the future. Right? So, yeah, I don't think this is supposed to be
Yeah, but it's
eternal life, but I think it is supposed to be continuity of identity. Yeah?
It's a question.
Yes, it is. It's a good question. Right. So there's the profound thing. What's the surface meaning that I was trying to get everyone to notice? Flowing through time is the essence of the point that Bergson was trying to highlight in this short book, An Introduction to Metaphysics. And that the self which endures and the personality, he couldn't talk about time and its flow without talking about human existence and human perception of it. Brenda?
I keep on bringing up my many years that I spent with Alzheimer's people at Loretto,
Mhm.
where all of this is not true.
Mm.
Because their self does not endure.
Yes, right.
They are unable to remember how to swallow at the end, so they die of starvation.
Yeah.
And
And
the-
yet, Alzheimer's is considered a horrible affliction precisely because it robs human beings.
of yourself, it robs you of
Yes.
everything.
Yes.
And it, like, I know people who, they try to talk the person into to believing that, well, you're really 85 and your mother really died 40 years ago, and they look at you like, well, that's the craziest thing I ever heard of. So you end up spending your whole day talking to people about how, oh yeah, your mother's gonna pick you up in 10 minutes. And you become so crazy by the time you leave that environment, you don't even know your own self.
Right. So our connection to time and this feeling of flow is really an essential thing. Let's look at a slightly longer selection from the same work by Bergson. Mark, do you want to?
This inner life may be compared to the unrolling of a coil, for there is no living being who does not feel himself coming gradually to the end of his roll. And to live is to grow old. But it may just as well be compared to the continual rolling up, like that of a thread on a ball. For our past follows us, it swells incessantly with the present, that it picks up on its way, and consciousness means memory.
Okay. So adding these similes of the coil of our life rolling out, or the ball of our experiences gradually getting larger, but Bergson is as much interested in the action of the unrolling or the rolling, and if you read him, he tries very hard to say, you know what, none of these metaphors are perfect because, darn it, the coil's gonna roll out, it's not the coil, it's the action, it's the drawing out, whatever. Yes, Mark?
I'm thinking of the Greek mythological three women who take a thread and
The
starts the
fates.
life, and then
Yes,
somebody
right, yes,
cuts it.
yeah, right, that's really good, and probably that was on Bergson's model. All right, now, I started out telling you that I was going to try to convince you that physics will have none of this. But before I do that, I want to show you something written by our founder, Isaac Newton, from his great work that founded physics as we know it today, the Principia. And would you read these words of wisdom from Newton?
Absolute, true, and mathematical time of itself and from its own nature flows equably without regard to anything external, and by another name is called duration.
So, at the beginnings of physics, the best physicist who ever lived, or second best, depending on which camp you're in, was perfectly happy to say time flows. And not only that, it flows equably at a steady pace. It's interesting. Okay? Keep this in mind as we move on to a spokesperson for contemporary physics, Brian Greene, who had a whole PBS television show called The Fabric of the Cosmos. And from the episode that he called The Illusion of Time, he had these words to say. Jeff, are you up to reading source 7?
Time seems to flow endlessly from one moment to the next, and the flow of time seems to always be in one direction, towards the future. That may not be right. Discoveries over the last century have shown that much of what we think about time may be nothing more than an illusion. Contrary to everyday experience, time may not flow at all. Our past may not be gone, our future may already exist.
So, I can't think of a stronger contrast with Newton But I will also say that Green is in fact talking, as I'll explain in a few moments, about the consensus view about time in physics today. But does anyone see anything weird about when Green is moving from his description of the illusions that most of us perceive and is giving us the wisdom of what physics actually tells you about time? Does anyone see anything weird in his rhetoric?
There is no flow of time there.
Okay, that's his claim. But does he make that claim forthrightly and definitively and with confidence?
Would you repeat what you said?
What Mireille said was, well, why don't you say it again a little louder?
There is no flow of time.
No flow.
Because our past may not be gone. And
May.
our future may
Yes. What a weasel. He's got a whole hour of PBS time, and his whole point is to push this idea that time doesn't flow, and he can't even say it with confidence. I think that's really interesting. And I actually read the whole transcript of the whole hour, and every time he comes to state this dramatic conclusion, it's always got a weasel word. It's amazing, okay? But I think there's a reason, right? And let's work together to see if we can understand how Green may have been stuck and felt he needed a weasel word.
Peter, well, it was on public TV.
It was on public TV, absolutely,
Right. Well,
yes.
public TV
Yeah.
has to bridge a number of worlds.
No, not when they do science shows. Science shows, they, the experts just always declare, okay? All right, they do. So, I think it's actually really interesting that he didn't feel like he was in a position to declare. So, the question I'd like us to continue to focus on is this set of questions. Does time flow, or is that sensation of flow an illusion? And linked to it is the question, and I'll make these diagrams probably to most of you all are just hieroglyphs at the moment, but I'll be explaining what they mean in a few minutes. When we think about what exists, what's real, is our idea of what exists or what's real limited to now, to the present moment, or is it past, present, and future all taken together as equally real and equally existent? So let me walk us through a set of an easy exercise, a set of diagrams that will take these hieroglyphic pictures and make them have some meaning. So, what the technical name for what I'm about to explain is a space-time diagram. I want everyone to understand what a space-time diagram is within the next 2 minutes. I hope you'll get there. So, to construct a space-time diagram, let's first think of a set of moments of time. And here we've got 4 moments of time labeled January, presumably some particular day and hour in January, one labeled April, July, and October. And in fact, I think this is supposed to be 4 frames from a movie, if you like, of the orbit of the Earth around the sun. That star in the middle is supposed to represent the sun, and that dot on that circle there is supposed to represent the Earth. And you can see it's going around the sun. And you can imagine a 5th frame, January of the next year, where the Earth has come back around to the top. Okay, 4 frames in a movie. Now, if you want to build a space-time diagram, I invite you to take those 4 views of the world and stack them. And separate them by an amount in this vertical direction of stacking that corresponds to how much time has elapsed from one view of the world to the next. So we've got January, April, July, October. Well, they're equal in space because there's 3 months between each one. And the next January would be up here, and so on. And I want to make clear, in case this diagonal drawing isn't obvious, that there's some perspective being used to imagine these planes and stacking them up, okay? None of these things are obvious, even though those of us who use these tricks all the time, they're obvious to us. But so here is a time axis, if you like, and we've put in these views of the world at a height along the time axis corresponding to when the thing happened. So now, all we have to do is say, you know what? Yeah, this was really a graph, a 3-dimensional graph. In each of those individual views of the world, those were 2 of the 3 dimensions of space. And we already drew the explicit time axis, so here's a space axis. Maybe this is the x direction, here's the y direction. We're not sketching the z direction. We don't have good enough screens to do that, or good enough eyes, or whatever. But we're using instead the vertical direction to represent time. And so here are those 4 views, but now notice that in this diagram, there's been a helix drawn in to suggest to you that, well, you know, the solar system actually existed in February and March, and in May and June, okay? And it's not just 4 slices there. There's as many slices as you care to think about. And the Earth's orbit around the sun, when you represent it with time as this 3rd dimension, becomes a helix in space-time. Okay. All right, anyone want to ask a question about that? Because I'm going to draw some more space-time diagrams. Okay, all right, so we got space-time, right? So, one other technical thing. If you follow the position of an individual object through time and connect all those positions with a curve like that, there's a jargon name for that curve. That's called that object's world line.
What is it?
World line.
World line?
World line. Okay. So,
Why world line?
because some German physicists at the beginning of the century coined a German term that we translate as world line. I don't know. Has to have some name, but line is shorthand for what's a generally curve or a path of some kind. World is supposed to just represent that this is now a way of describing how the world works, I guess. Something. Anyway, what's in a name? That's the name we call it. All right, so now maybe this diagram will represent something. This rhombus on the screen is supposed to be a perspectival view of a square cut out of a whole plane of space. So 2 of the 3 dimensions, think of that being stretched out in all of those directions, and also there's a suppressed 3rd dimension that we won't think about. But this is something from this is a slice, a horizontal slice in a space-time diagram. And so a horizontal slice in a space-time diagram represents what?
An instant.
An instant of time. Okay, so this blue stand-in for the whole instant of time is supposed to represent, given that there's no more instants drawn up here or down there, a particular instant, and I'm using it to represent the idea that only the present is real. Now, I may or may not believe that, but when I do believe it, this drawing represents that idea, that only the present is real. Yes, Jeff?
So for an individual human being,
Yes.
the present can be represented that way.
Yeah.
But for the universe, you have instants all over the place.
Yeah.
Can they be all connected as an instance? I thought in
Let's
relativity
hold
you
that
could do
question.
Okay.
That is exactly the question that we need to consider. So, I forgot to mention one other feature of this diagram. Okay, the reason there are these dashed arrows pointing upwards is supposed to represent the idea of now being the only thing that's real, but now sweeps upward through a space-time diagram, according to this perception we have of the flow of time.
And every time you say the word now, it's a different now.
Yes,
Exactly.
right. Uh-huh. Yep. And what do we make of that? So, there's lots of linguistic difficulties in talking about these different points of view in a completely logical and consistent manner. Okay, so this is now a symbol that I hope everyone can read for the idea that some people hold that the present is the only thing that's real, and that the present moves upward through space-time diagrams. That is to say, we live our lives and we live them forward, and we wait until tomorrow and it's tomorrow.
Is the upward movement because that's what our language implies
Well, all right.
Convention.
with
It's meant-
future or
I mean,
some, or,
why is it upward or why is it moving?
no, why is it upward?
Because somebody chose to draw space-time diagrams that way. And there are other communities of physicists that actually make the flow of time to the right. So, okay, if you're a relativist, you draw them this way. If you're a particle physicist, you make time increase to the right. All right? It's just a convention. I'm going to stick with the relativity convention. So for the whole time we're together tonight, time moves upward. Okay? Now, here is the contrasting view. This is supposed to be a cube cut out of a whole space-time diagram. And notice, nothing is colored in blue. There's no plane drawn in that diagram representing any particular moment of time. There's some parts of this symbol that are low, some in the middle, some high. And notice here's a world line of some object doing some somewhat random stuff. And so this, representing a big chunk of a space-time diagram and not just a section of a slice, represents the idea. Now I'm just drawing pictures. I'm not defending one idea or the other. I'm just explaining what the pictures are. But this picture represents the idea that past, present, and future are all equally real, and that there is no basis for picking out any particular present moment as special as representing us now. Judy.
What do you mean by real?
That's lecture 4 in this 3-lecture series.
You do cut it off at the top and at the bottom.
That's for the same reason. It's cut off at the top and the bottom for the same reason that that blue rhombus representing a square is cut off at the edges, just because I'm bored.
Oh,
Okay? Or because I want to fit something in that I can point to. If that didn't have any cut off edges, it would just be beige mush and you wouldn't know what it meant.
Artistic reason.
Right, right. But you're raising like a profound question for visualization of data sets when you have, let's do a chemistry example. Let's have, an amazingly complicated biomolecule, all right? We know how to build models, right, and look at it from the outside. But now think of something like a cell. You were at my previous lecture, right?
Yes.
Yes, you were. You remember that movie of the inner workings of the cell that I showed briefly? The notion of how you represent complex three-dimensional data with no edges that you aren't interested in looking at from the outside. Those were images made from the inside of a cell. It's a really tricky thing. All right? So this is the trick that's being used just so you can sketch something, and then you're supposed to fill in the fact that, no, those boundaries are just there, so I have something to sketch. But in principle, you can go further east, further west, further north, further south. or to a later time, or to an earlier time, in principle. All right, so now, before I say more, I want to do a straw poll. This will not be recorded. Your grade does not depend on which answer you give. But I want everyone in the room to commit to raising your hand either for point A, what is real, everything in the universe as those things exist now, or do you accept as real everything in the universe from the beginning of time for all time into the future? Okay, straw poll. Who is more comfortable with view A, that what's real is now? Okay, who is more comfortable with view B? Wow, a bunch of physicists. I had no idea.
Can they both be?
You
Can they
want
both?
C? All of the above?
All of the above?
Okay, that's fine, that's fine.
How about none of the above?
None of the above.
Yeah.
No.
I don't know if it was the Beatles who said it or it was a Beatles parody to say, it's all in the mind, you know?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so that was fascinating. That was really fascinating. Okay, but that's great. I said I wasn't going to grade you. Okay? It was just a straw poll. All right, so most of the people in this room are prepared, are either physicists are ready or prepared to be convinced by the physics point of view. And when popularizers or explainers or evangelists for relativity look for a pithy summary of the idea encapsulated in option B, that everything that exists from the beginning to the end of time, throughout all time, is what's real, they often, quite often, turn to this really nice sentence. Yes?
In that view, is there an end of time?
Well, that's a separate question. That's lecture 5. Okay? Rabbi,
It depends where you're standing.
does it?
Yeah.
Whether there's an end of time or not?
No, whether something's real or not.
Ah, go on.
What?
It depends whether,
It happens way over there, but I'm over here.
Yeah.
By the time I can perceive it, it's not real over there anymore.
okay, yes. All right, our view of the world is strongly colored by this horribly slow speed of light, which is the speed limit for all signals. It only travels at 1 light year per year. So,
By definition.
But it's not just by definition, even though it is, right? It's meaningful in the sense that the rabbi meant, that our view of time, our view of the universe.
Well, it's not arbitrary.
Pardon?
It's not arbitrary.
It's neither arbitrary, but it makes a difference that it's not infinite. Right? It really makes a difference that the speed of light is finite and not infinite. Okay? Given that the universe is huge. Right? So it does make a difference to the view. All right. So that's option D. Good. All right. So here is one of the great systematizers, explainers, summarizers, and pioneers of relativity post-Einstein, Hermann Weyl. And this sentence that Weyl wrote is often taken as the summary derived from relativity, as I will explain in only another minute or two, that option B is the correct answer. And let's see, I think we're up to the rabbi. Would you read source 7, or source 8, source 8, which actually is on
The objective world simply is. It does not happen.
Is, does not happen. And that sentence was very carefully written to use the word happen to say, no, I'm not talking about flow, I'm denying flow or passage or whichever words we use to describe our experience.
I'm curious about the word objective. What is?
Stephen, what a good reader. Hold that question. Hold that question. It's a great question. Most physicists say, aren't we just interested in the objective world? Okay, so most of us don't notice it, but good noticing and hold hold that thought for a few more minutes. So, as proof that that this has become the received view, received from us, or by us from Einstein. Oops. Oh, I'll get to my Einstein quote in a moment. Let me explain how this idea is interpreted as the received view. So I've drawn here another space-time diagram. Again, just a cube of one, not extending as far to the north, south, east, and west, and past and future, but it's supposed to be a section of that. And inside this section of space-time, I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 world lines corresponding, one of them is labeled birth and death, so those are the world lines representing the location, if not the actual activity or experience of 5 different people. And this diagram is supposed to encapsulate this idea that there's no particular moment in the universe or no particular moment even in a human life that is special enough to deserve being called out as the present, now, or whatever. Instead, in this view of reality, birth, what was the line from Twilight
Birth,
Zone?
death, infinity.
Yes, yes, good. Right, it's all one. We're not all one, they're different, but no particular slice of time has any special meaning or reality. So we interpret this sentence, the objective world simply is, it does not happen. But can that be so? The reason Weil was in a position to write that sentence is because of what everyone in the world was taught by Einstein in 1905. And what he showed was that there's an enormous difficulty, and apparently, and not just apparently, if you don't know anything, really apparently, there's an apparently insuperable difficulty in believing in a present, believing in the existence of a now and only one now at a time. And that is that when you analyze how time works according to the ideas that we learned from Einstein, you realize that there is no well-defined way to say all these things are at the same time. You can't consistently define a present in a way that every observer of the universe will agree with it. You can surely define a present. We can all say, okay, we've all synchronized our watches, and when it's 9 o'clock, Saulson had better have shut up a half hour ago. Okay? But somebody on a rocket ship blasting through the room would not agree with all of our watches. Okay? And here is a diagram that I just want to assert. If I were teaching beginning physics, I might take a week or even 2 weeks to get the students to believe in this diagram. But I want to use it just as a symbol of the idea that we learned from Einstein. So this is a space-time diagram, but it's a slightly simpler version. It doesn't try to represent 2 dimensions of space in perspective. It just tries to represent 1 dimension of space from left to right, and then time moving from the bottom to the top. And in this space-time diagram are 3 events, 3 occurrences, labeled A, B, and C. And the beginning of this loop, you see nice square grid lines representing a view of the world according to an observer who is at rest with those 3 objects, or the objects that are there. And in that view of the world that we're calling V equals 0, those 3 events, things that happened at a particular clock time at a particular place, to that observer, those three events happen simultaneously. We'll get to it. Ready? Here's time sweeping forward, and all three of those events are encountered by a given moment of time, as seen by that observer at the same time. But now, there's also a view of the world according to an observer who's moving to the right at a considerable speed, and that's this one, and that observer says, no, C happened first. B happened second, and A happened last. But when we talk about an observer moving to the left, the observer to the left sees A happening first, B in the middle, C last. Take it on faith, this is what relativity says. Okay? I know I haven't explained why it's true, but I just want everyone to have that as a pronouncement that was not only just pronounced by Einstein, but Einstein managed to convince everyone who worked and struggled with his equations defining relativity to say, yeah, you're right. There is no unambiguous way for everyone in the world to agree on what set of events happen at the same time. If events are spatially separated, you can either find a way to think that they are happening at the same time, or there's another observer traveling on a different rocket ship who says, no, that one's first, that one's second, that one is third. And so, if you will accept for purposes of argument tonight, and if you really want to understand this, let me know. And I'll be glad to take a couple of weeks to explain it to you. I would love nothing more than to do that.
Peter?
Yes?
So, from our puny little human standpoint, what you just showed us, this to me implies enormous spans of time and space.
Well,
But-
or enormous speeds.
Or enormous speeds.
Right.
But the way
Yes.
we exist,
Yes.
we don't experience the universe that way.
That is correct. And thank you for pointing that out, Judy, because notice that hidden there at the bottom is a statement that one of those speeds is 3/10 of the speed of light, and the other one is half the speed of light. These effects are only noticeable for high speeds, or very precise measurements, okay, that make up for not high speeds. All right, but this leads us to a conundrum, a dilemma. If it's really the case that there is no way to have an unambiguous, agreed upon meaning to what time is now everywhere in the universe, can we believe in only the present being real, given that the present has no good meaning to it? Somebody says, another set of events is the present. So a way of saying it in terms of a space-time diagram, when I first drew that first space-time diagram, I said, oh, a horizontal slice represents a particular moment of time. But what Einstein taught us, and what Weil was emphasizing, is that to some people, the slices are tipped. And to other people, they're tipped a different way. And to other people, they're tipped into the screen or out of the screen. So you can't just say, oh no, it's this slice that's real. Because that slice only corresponds to now or the present for some people and not others.
But isn't it all real?
Pardon?
Isn't it all real?
Or if you picked option B, you're fine. You're happy right now. But anyone who raised their hand for option A is saying, oh, my head hurts. This makes no sense. Right? So, yes, precisely what you're saying. This is taken as a knockdown argument for option B. That all of past, present, and future must have equal reality to them. Don't just have slices that are real.
Judy was saying for us puny humans who are not moving near the speed of light. Everything seems to be present.
Yeah.
And event B in the center didn't move. Is that us?
Well, that's just a convention, okay?
No, but that's our perception of reality, so it's right there, there we are.
Yeah.
Right, if you're standing at C, then B would have been moving.
So have I convinced you? The objective world simply does not happen. Brent?
Sorry about, what's the middle word there between death and?
Oh, I stole this off of Google Images, and the word says initiation. And I actually don't know what it means, and I should have covered it over with some PowerPoint magic. But think of it as just any particular moment. I want some point along the world line, because the idea that my consciousness is registering things at a particular time is an idea we want to think about. But why it's labeled initiation, I should have just covered it up. Yeah.
But for an observer somewhere in the universe, we are moving with close to the speed.
Yes,
of light.
that's right. For some other observer, we are the ones that are moving.
Right.
And that's the idea of relativity, that you can't say who's at rest and who's
There's no
moving.
origin to that coordinate
Yeah,
system.
right. Brenda.
I'm tired, I can't think of the word. The notion about time travel and that, what is it, that you drop through a black hole?
The wormhole?
This is
The
lecture.
wormhole.
This is lecture 29.
Star Trek.
Okay.
Sorry. All right. Now I want to convince you that Einstein not only believed this on his day job, but when he was at his most miserable, most abject, he really believed it. And my proof is this few sentences that he wrote to the parents of his longtime best friend and confidant, Michele Besso, who passed away about a year or so before Einstein himself. And who is reading? Is it Jeff? This is source 9, if you prefer. You can read off the screen if your eyes are good enough.
Now he has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing. People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion.
Illusion, that's where Brian Greene got the word from this letter of Einstein, who was trying to not be as sad as he felt at having lost his friend Besson. Okay, but
Is that a consolation?
Hmm?
Is that a consolation?
Is that a consolation? Well, I think he meant it to be a consolation in the
Yes,
sense that, all right, in some sense we're all still alive in some sense. In some
Yeah.
sense we're all dead. In some sense we've all never been born. Okay. Is it consoling or not? I don't know, but I know that that's what Einstein was trying to do with that.
Yeah, it's the fight between the intellectuality, reason and emotions.
Yeah,
How do
that's
they
true. Yeah. And
answer
maybe
this?
Einstein was a world-class genius of intellect, and he was kind of a B- or a C- on the emotion scale, as near as I can tell. Ask his first wife. All right, but now I want to point out that we took Weil out of context. Immediately after this slogan sentence, the objective world simply is, it does not happen. And who was asking about objective? Stephen. Okay, your question is now going to be responded to. Here is the sentence that follows immediately thereafter. Judy, start with the beginning.
The objective world simply is, it does not happen. Only to the gaze of my consciousness, crawling along the lifeline of my body, does a section of this world come to life as a fleeting image in space, which continuously changes in time.
So even Weil didn't believe this stuff. Or maybe the distinction is precisely why he inserted the word objective in the first sentence. And then in the second sentence, should have had the twin word, subjective, but he's spelled it out, the gaze of my consciousness. But he's got this picture, he really has this picture that our consciousness crawls along our world line.
So he must really detach it from his body. Because his body is still in the past.
Well, his body is past.
No, his body isn't moving. It's the world line.
Yeah. Right. So the consciousness moves, the body is everywhere, because the body is material or objective.
Consciousness doesn't.
Yeah, the consciousness is kind of lighting up. Yeah. This is getting interesting, right? So, Weil says that at least as far as human experience is concerned, this diagram is essential. It's not just not wrong, it's part of how the world is, as long as we include in our view of the world not just what we call objective, but include also the fact that there are consciousnesses in it, ours, each and every one of ours. And Einstein never wrote this, but a philosopher friend of his, or a philosopher who said, I talked to Einstein once, said this is what Einstein told him at another moment, not when he was writing that letter of consolation. Howard, do you want to read this bit from Carnap?
Once Einstein said that the problem of the now worried him seriously. He explained that the experience of the now means something special for man, something essentially different from the past and the future, but that this important difference does not and cannot occur within physics. That this experience cannot be described in science seemed to him a matter of painful but inevitable resignation. Einstein thought that these scientific descriptions cannot possibly satisfy our human needs, that there is something essential about how the now, which is just which is just outside the realm of science.
Well, what do you know? But maybe Carnap got it wrong, or was blowing up his own thoughts and putting them in, since there was no other record of this conversation other than Carnap's report. But, let's put that down to the side for a moment. If we assume that this is a trustworthy account of a conversation Einstein had, at least some of the time he was not saying that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Other times, night sweats or something, he recognized or was troubled by the possibility that, in spite of everything he taught us about time, that there's something about the now. Alan.
Would there be a concept of time if we did not have a consciousness?
Well, according to physics, there would be a time axis in space-time diagrams that described how the objective world worked. Whether there would be anything else about flow of time, I think that's an excellent question. I think what Weil was saying in his second sentence and what Einstein, as quoted by Carnap, is saying in this paragraph is that this notion that there is a now and that this now is moving is intimately associated with human experience. So whatever is this mystery that we call consciousness and that we experience, but that I have never found any scientific sounding descriptions that let me bring it into correspondence with the objective description of the world that I learned as a student of physics. So your question is precisely the right one. Yeah, Julie.
You're talking about time, but you're talking about time from the point of view of an American person living in America.
Well, or a German person living in Germany in the 20th century.
But other cultures experience time differently. And we can joke about Jewish Standard Time, and everybody comes late. Or there are cultures where if you show up anytime on Tuesday, you're on time. And there are cultures where time, even though we mark it the same way, it's not the same thing.
Right. And you're making an excellent point, and I know a tiny bit about it, but evidently a lot less than you. But let me ask you this. What I would really want to know is what those other cultures' poets and songwriters have to say about it. Okay, because that's where I think, so yeah, what counts as late to a party, yes, is vastly different among different cultures. But whether it's an entirely different, whether there's anyone who lives in this four-dimensional, in this, I'll give it a name, frozen space-time, four-dimensional or eternal world. Are there any cultures that actually are like that? Who saw the movie Arrival? The gimmick of that movie was supposed to be that those space creatures actually live in the eternal world. And yet they have conversations with us, whatever, you know, okay. It's hard to produce a narrative that makes sense if what you believe in is all times are equally valid. But, all right, so my question is, are there any cultures that we know of in our world that are like the Arrival creatures? I don't know. But it's an interesting point. All right, so what I want to say before moving on to part 3, which may not be as long as these other 2 parts of my talk, is that I hope everyone has been agreeably confused. Okay. Has taken pleasure in this apparent conflict between 2 points of view, each of which on its own is obviously correct. But they're both obviously correct. Right.
Do I understand correctly, thinking that for Einstein, then after this citation, he would associate, physics and intellectuality and the sense of time, and then with the now, with the instant, would be the emotions, you see, would be
Emotions
what is fleeting.
Perhaps. I would propose slightly different words, but I think they correspond to the ones you're using. I'd say objective or subjective, material or experiential. All right, but your words aren't wrong. I just want to use other ones.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So, all this stuff, I keep thinking that men are the ones that create these concepts.
Yeah.
And men are always the ones that deal with more with the physical aspect of things, it seems. I think that's what Mireille is sort of trying to say. And it's all very physical to me. The whole thing seems very physical. It's a time and space and the universe. It's all, well, Heschel might have been an exception to that.
We'll get to him in a minute,
But it seems all very just I don't know what other word I can use.
It seems
very
male.
Very
seems
physical.
male.
And material,
Yes.
the material world, the physical world.
Right.
And women, it'd be nice to see if women.
There are some women
wrote
relativists,
about these
and I think
things.
they buy into this. Okay, so, all
I'm
right.
not saying I don't buy into it.
Yeah.
But I don't think
That's right.
that.
Didn't you vote for option B?
I think they're both right, and I think, I think, that's the other thing, always to think in terms of one answer or one concept.
Ah, I love that. Let's
One
think
answer
of that.
or one concept
That's a
doesn't do
great,
it for me.
Yeah. That's
You
a
know.
great segue. Thank you.
You're
for
welcome.
that. So, all right. So, we've got human experience, women's experience, if you want, that we exist in a present moment or a now that moves through time. We've got this masculine physics story that says either you buy into this notion that it's all the same or you're not thinking straight. but each of them seems, when you're in the right mood, to be just like obviously the only correct
Can we
way of
just say
seeing
that this whole concept is gender fluid?
Okay. There we go. Okay.
Thank you.
Is there any way to follow up on Sherry's idea that maybe we shouldn't try to pick one or the other? Maybe we need resources from both and need to live in the tension between the two. And that's where I want to turn to Heschel, who is someone who's very well known as a Jewish theologian, philosopher, social activist. He's also my personal hero in the way he explains Judaism. His most famous 3 books, if I had to pick out 3, are A Sabbath and Man is Not Alone, both from 1951, God in Search of Man, 1955, but we could list some others that are also good. These in particular, from the early first half of the 1950s, if you read them with an eye sharpened by this kind of problem, you'll realize what he's doing is developing a theology of time. And what I mean by a theology of time is that he shows how you can use the pair of conflicting, divergent views as actually a resource for deriving a life of meaning. And that's what I want to show you now. So, some texts to read. We are up to 12A. Did Melissa read?
The boundless, continuous, but vacuous entity, which realistically is called space, is not the ultimate form of reality. Our world is a world of space moving through time, from the beginning to the end of days.
Okay, so here Heschel is sounding like the complement of Einstein. He's saying, you know what? There's one right answer. There is a world of space moving through time. The blue plane moving upward. But it gets more interesting. Source B. Julie, do you want to read?
Time is like an eternal burning bush. Though each instant must vanish to open the way for the next one, time itself is not consumed. Time has independent, ultimate significance. It is of more majesty and more provocative of awe than a sky studded with stars.
All right, let's dwell here a moment. So, instants vanishing. That sounds like option A. Time itself is not consumed. Option B, maybe. Now, especially for those of you who were at lecture 1 or wished you were, notice, okay, that Heschel is saying that this thing I'm pointing to is a tremendous source of wonder, perhaps even, among the most important sources of wonder at all, surely more provocative of awe than even a sky studded with stars, which is one of our classic scenes evocative of wonder. Okay, so,
That is satisfying. That is satisfying.
That's satisfying. Maybe you'll be even more satisfied with sources C and D.
Time is both near and far, intrinsic to all experience and transcending all experience. It belongs exclusively to God. Time, then, is otherness, a mystery that hovers above all categories. It is as if time and the mind were a world apart. Yet it is only within time that there is fellowship and togetherness of all beings.
Okay, so it's a mystery, transcends all experience, and yet the most important thing about it, it is actually the medium. Time is the medium in which we experience being, or it's the medium in which experience or subjectivity even can be talked about. And such important transcendent mysteries that hover above all categories, for Heschel it's almost a waste of words to then also say it belongs exclusively to God. And of course Heschel wanted to write those words, it was very important, but I'm making that remark because I think here Heschel is actually describing how we encounter God in this world as well. So this is where his philosophy of time becomes actually a theology of time. Text D, and your name is?
Alex.
Alex, would you please read text 12D?
We can only solve the problem of time through sanctification of time. To men alone, time is elusive. To men with God, time is eternity in disguise. Creation is the language of God. Time is his song, and things of the space, the consonants in the song. To sanctify time is to sing the vowels in unison with him.
Great. All right, we're surely in theological language by now, right? Is it option A or option B? To men with God, time, temporality, is eternity in disguise. So, Heschel is out now with Sherry as needing to live in the tension between these two different views. Neither one is good enough to understand what existence is all about. To men alone, time is elusive. To men with God, excuse the sexist language, time is eternity in disguise. And I don't think Heschel is just making this up. And here is a bit from the Siddur that when suddenly two words from this prayer upon awakening jumped out at me for the first time, the top of my head almost blew off. How often in our liturgy do you see God described by these two adjectives paired together? Here it's Melech Chai V'Kayim, living and eternal, or sometimes living and enduring. It's everywhere. It's everywhere in our liturgy. So I think Heschel is on good Jewish grounds for saying, no, it's not just the living experience of the world that matters, nor is it just the eternal view that matters. We have to take these two together. They come together all the time. Chai v'kayim. El melech chai v'kayim. I can easily point you to 3 or 4 places in the Siddur, and Carla Rose, maybe y'all can do better. I don't know. But whenever you see that pair of adjectives, or shall I put rabbis on the spot? How many times do we have chai v'kayim?
I just looked it up, so
What's the
answer? Advantage. So far, it's in the low. It's in like the several hundreds.
In the Siddur.
Wow. The Siddur is dozens.
Wow. Okay. All right.
So that tension between what did you say, between the present and
Between presentism and eternalism.
and eternalism, I think that tension is sort of the movement of time, the moving business, the flow and the move is that tension.
No, the flow is the presentism.
Oh, okay.
If you've got that, you're thinking about the moving present.
Okay, but somehow that tension has movement
Yes.
to it, has a movement to it.
That tension has tension to it. I'll agree with you. Yeah. Okay. So, one last text from Heschel, and your name is?
Haley.
Haley, would you please read text 14, or from the screen, as you prefer.
Eternity is not perpetual future, but perpetual presence. There is the meaning of existence, to reconcile liberty with service, to weave the threads of temporality into the fabric of eternity.
Cool, huh? So Heschel is planting himself firmly in both camps to weave the threads of temporality into the fabric of eternity. This is Jewish living. This is the mitzvot. Get up in the morning and daven shachrit. On down the line, the rhythm of it all is a way to reconcile our human freedom with service of God by building an eternity made up of the right rhythms and patterns. So, did I convince you all that we've got these 2 points of view, temporality, eternity, and to Heschel, Jewish living is devoted to redeeming temporal existence by linking it to the eternal, by weaving the threads of time into the fabric of eternity. Mark?
As a mathematician, please let me try to state a mathematical analogy to this conflict. And it would be in geometry, the difference between Euclidean and hyperbolic geometry. We learn in Euclidean geometry in school that if you're given a line and a point not on the line, there's a unique other line through that point parallel to the first line. That's Euclidean geometry.
Right.
In hyperbolic geometry, there can be infinitely many lines through that point, not parallel to the given line. So what do we mean by parallel? Lines that never meet, or meet at eternity, at infinity. And if one looks at a neighborhood of a point, the two geometries look alike.
Yes.
And the bigger the neighborhood you go, the more you see the divergence between these two geometries.
Right.
But locally,
Right.
there's no distinction.
Yeah, okay. Locally, there's no distinction there, but globally there is. I think your analogy is like almost wonderful, but I think the claim here is that you would think that one or the other must be right, and we just can't figure it out. Anyway, I'm not sure. Maybe your analogy is wonderful. I'm sorry.
It seems to me that being able to live this way, constantly aware that every moment is part of the eternal, that's basically the definition of faith.
Okay, yeah, maybe, yeah, cool. Howard.
I was alive and conscious yesterday.
Yeah.
It was. I'm fairly confident of two things. One is that our consciousness is much spottier than we think it is. But the other thing is that I'm pretty sure I was conscious at about 3 o'clock yesterday. Anyway, in the afternoon. And on the assumption, let's say that somehow my body is a generator of my consciousness in some fashion, perhaps. My body was generating consciousness then, right? And it's still there, back there in space-time, generating consciousness. And yet, I have no access to that except through my memory.
Yeah.
And that guy yesterday is as radically different from me as anyone else in this room is different from me, or they're all different from each other.
Except you've got that guy's
At least have that
memories.
illusion anyway.
Except you've got that guy's memories.
Except that I've got that guy's memories, but I don't have any direct access to that guy's consciousness then. Right?
Yeah.
And that strikes me as at the bottom of why Einstein's letter is not so consoling.
Yeah, okay.
Well,
I
you do have
hear you.
access to that if you recognize.
That's still a
connectivity
conceptual
of
thing. They
everything.
don't have direct perceptual access to it.
Okay, I'd like to wrap up my standing here as a sage on the stage and just show you 2 more slides. One is an advertisement for lecture 3 of 3, which will happen 8 days from now at the JCC, 7 p.m., not 7:30. Okay, just be aware. And in this third lecture, I am going to talk about the most explicit way I've found in my reading of Heschel, where Heschel tries to bridge the gap between science and religion in the form of what I think is a really novel argument for the existence of God. So that's what I'll be talking about in lecture 3. And now, without my looking in the directions of my new friends Alex and Haley, I would like to present to you all this opportunity that we're offering if you would like to be connected with a scientist, engineer, physician at a more advanced level of age than you all for one-on-one study. Please take and fill out one of the contact me forms, but we won't be staring at you to see if you fill them out, believe them or not. It's just an invitation. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention and your questions.
I would also like to thank our hosts at Hillel. Thank you for being so gracious and for doing setup for us and having us here today. So thank you so much.
We've done it? All right, we have cookies, we have caffeinated coffee, we have maybe a few other things, some donut holes too.